Are they in business to try to undermine themselves? I mean, these are big corporate structures. Are they in business to try to help people undermine them? You know, it doesn't take a genius to figure out they're not doing that. They're in business to try to make you passive and obedient, just like the school system is, which has the same power source. That should be understood by everybody. Now that in itself doesn't get you an avenue to truth, but it tells you where to start. Start by being very skeptical about anything that comes to you from any sort of power system. And in fact, you should also be skeptical about everything else. You should be skeptical about what I'm telling you. Why should you believe a word of it? You know, I got my own axe to grind. So figure it out for yourself, you know. And there is no other answer, any more than there is when you're studying science. Like when I teach, tomorrow I'm going to be teaching graduate courses at MIT, and you know, students know that they're not supposed to believe me. If they believe me, you're not going to, you know, we wouldn't even pass them. You know, they have to challenge what they hear and figure out what's wrong with it, and you know, do it better, and so on. In the natural sciences, that's taken for granted. Actually, that's one reason I like MIT and stay there. It doesn't have the atmosphere of the humanities and the social sciences. It has the atmosphere of the natural sciences. And even though the people can be extremely reactionary, it's a much more honest place, just because you're driven by the values of the natural sciences. And everybody should be. You know, that's just ordinary rationality. I don't think you have to teach it to people either. I think you have to beat it out of their heads. Like I think children understand it.
That's the last questions. It's all we have time for. So take all your questions. Be disobedient in your classes the rest of the semester. Thank you for coming.
Okay.
We have exactly 15 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we can be a little, yeah, we'll be a little late. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. I'll try to be briefer. Okay, let's not waste any time.
Questions?
You picking? Yeah.
Well, in the last group you mentioned briefly that classical liberalism is very anti-capitalist. And I got a sense of what you're referring to, but if you briefly expand on that.
Actually, I'm going to be talking about that in the thing later, and I will expand on it a lot. But if you think about classical liberalism, it was based on the idea of, I mean, like, for example, why was Adam Smith in favor of markets? He was in favor of markets. He gave a kind of a complicated argument for markets, but at the core of it was the idea that if you had perfect liberty, markets would lead to perfect equality. And that's why he was in favor of markets. Because he thought that people ought to be completely equal. And that the reason is that he being a classical liberal, he recognized that people's fundamental character involved notions like sympathy and solidarity and right to control their own work and so on and so forth. It's all the exact opposite of capitalism. You know, in fact, there are no two points of view more antithetical than classical liberalism and capitalism. That's why when the University of Chicago publishes a bicentennial edition of Smith, they have to distort the text, which they did. In fact, if you read George Stigler's introduction to the bicentennial edition, it's diametrically opposed to the text on point after point. I mean, the extent of the distortion, this is a scholarly edition, you know, University of Chicago bicentennial, so it's kind of interesting to look at it. For example, you know, Smith is famous for what he wrote about division of labor. Supposed to have thought that division of labor was a great thing. Well, he didn't. He thought division of labor was a terrible thing. And in fact, he says that in any civilized country, society, the government is going to have to intervene to prevent division of labor from simply destroying people. Well, take a look at the index, you know, detailed index for this scholarly edition of Adam Smith, and you find that, and take a look under division of labor, you won't find an entry for that passage. It's not there in the index. Okay, well, you know, that's real scholarship. I mean, suppress the facts totally, you know, and present them as the opposite of what they are and figure probably nobody's going to read the page 473 anyhow, because I didn't. You know, ask those guys who edited it if they ever read the page 473. Answer, well, they probably read the first paragraph and then sort of remembered what they'd been taught in you know, some college course.
Last night you referred to the kind of work that you do in this kind of political analysis as not very difficult. Anybody can do it. No major principles are involved. And I see what you mean. But on the other hand, I noticed in teaching that my student, it requires a major paradigm shift for students to be able to begin to accept the possibility that this kind of analysis is about.
That's right.
How do you bridge that gap?
I don't know. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, they've lived through their whole life being taught to obey authority. When you tried to question things, you were beaten down or kicked out. I mean, we all went through schools, you know, unlike I remember my own schooling. If the history teacher told you something you thought was pretty stupid, and you raised your hand and you said, I don't agree with that, I think it's wrong, you were going to be sent to the principal or some bad thing had happened to you, you know. On the other hand, if you just copy down whatever idiocy he said and then regurgitate it on the next exam and then forget about it, you were okay. And you learn that very quickly, you know. And it ends up with a kind of, first it changes people. You become obedient. The other thing is it filters people. People who aren't obedient get in real trouble. I mean, I taught children too, you know, children, I mean. And you can see, I mean, there are some who just don't take your word for it. And the kind of very unfortunate tendency is to try to beat them down because they're a pain in the neck, you know. But what they ought to be is encouraged. Yeah, why take my word for it? You know, who the heck am I? You know, figure it out, you know. I was lucky to go to a progressive school when I was a kid. I went to a Dewey experimental school. And there it was done routinely. Little children were encouraged to challenge everything. And you sort of worked on your own. You're supposed to think things through. It was a real experience, you know. In fact, it was quite a striking change when I went to I went there from about age, 1.5 up till 12. And then it ended, I went to this city high school, which was the pride of the city system, what's called these days a magnet school, like the one school for academically oriented kids who are going to work on their own anyway. So naturally it had the worst teachers. It was considered the sinecure of the system. If you were tired of teaching, you could go to that school because those kids are going to study anyhow. They all want to get into college. And it was the dumbest, most ridiculous place I've ever been. It was like falling into a black hole or something. But the transition was so sharp, it really had an effect. In fact, that was the first time I learned I was a good student. It was very competitive, of course, because that's one of the ways of controlling people is making things very competitive. So everybody's ranked, and you know exactly where you are. Are you third in the class, or maybe you move up down to fourth or something like that. And all of this is in people's heads, And so I suddenly learned I'm a good student. The issue had never arisen in 12 years of schooling, 10 years of schooling before that, because everybody was, encouraged to do what they, do their best, and you sort of help people and stuff like that. So the question never come up, As soon as you get into these systems, immediately you're ranked. It's competitive. You got to beat down the guy next to you, and all of those are techniques of enforced obedience. There's nothing necessary about them. I mean, there are other kinds of schooling which don't have them. In fact, I know because I went through it. In fact, as a teacher, I was also teaching in that framework, with a kind of Dewey educational framework. And it can certainly be done. It's not very remote from our experience. It's like very close. But how you break it down after 15 years of going through this stuff, that's hard. Actually, it's hard in the sciences. One of the things you have to teach people in science, you go to a place like MIT, say, where I teach. I mean, students have to learn that it doesn't matter. In fact, like there's one of the most famous physicists in the world, a guy named Vicky Weisskopf, who just retired, really super physicist. He used to always teach the freshman courses at MIT in physics, and he was famous for saying on the first day, students would ask him, what are we going to cover? And he would answer, it doesn't matter what you cover, it matters what you discover. So we're not going to bother with facts. You can read a book and find them out. We're going to learn how to discover things. Well, yeah, that's what you have to teach people in sciences. And when you get to a high-level place like MIT, it's mostly apprenticeship. You know, kind of science is like learning how to be a carpenter. I mean, you work with somebody who somehow knows how to do it, and you kind of get the idea, and you have the intuitions. And maybe the professor makes up the facts as he goes along, because if they're wrong, you can look up a handbook and get them right. It's not important. And that's the same sort of thing that has to be done in other fields.
What do you think about the terms of education that are sort of being tried as an antidote to the whole issue of the obedience theory, like classes being taught in Black English and advanced and slower students being taught together so that no one suffers and all that kind of stuff? What do you think about that?
It's interesting that it's called new methods. I mean, those are the old methods. You know, like tracking is a new thing. I don't know exactly when it starts, but if some of you are in education, you can tell me. But I know that tracking, you know, breaking kids into several tracks at the early stages, that's something new. Like it wasn't true when I was a kid. Everybody was together. I mean, you didn't know who was a slow learner, who was a fast learner. You know, you just learned. You know, you helped each other and stuff. When my kids were in school, by the time they were in 3rd grade, they were ranking every friend of theirs as smart and dumb. Why? Because the smart one, they were told, this guy's smart, he's in 3rd grade, you know, he's in the top track. This one's dumb, you know, he's in the low track, and somebody else in the middle track. I mean, you know, this is mind-boggling, but this is something new. So going back to putting what are called slow learners, meaning just people who are interested in different things and whatever else they do, in one place, yeah, that's kind of obvious, you know. In fact, most educational resources should be going to people who are, you know, having some problems, who can't just do it on their own, or who don't come from a family where it's all done for them anyhow. I mean, most of what you learn at home, you know. And those of us who were lucky enough to come from, you know, families that valued education or had resources or were, you know, so on, well, you just do it on your own. I mean, no matter how rotten the teaching is. But there are kids who don't have those advantages, and they're the ones who ought to have the, you know, the resources. As to teaching in Black English, that's a tricky question. It's like teaching Black English is just another language, you know. I mean, if black people owned the corporations, Black English would be considered mainstream English, and what you and I talk would be called some weird dialect, you know. This is just a question of who owns the place. It's just another language, you know. And the question of whether to teach in the native language or in a foreign language is always a tricky question in any society. Like, for example, take Germany, modern society. Most of the people in Germany don't speak German. They have to be taught German. Now it's less true than it was a generation ago, but a generation ago it was completely true. I mean, a person from Bavaria and a person from Northwest Germany couldn't even understand each other. Not the same language. They all had to be taught German, the standard language. And then a question arises. Do you teach the schools in their actual language, which may be Bavarian, or do you teach the schools in the standard language that you're trying to inculcate into them because it's a technique of advancement and a way of getting into the larger society and so on? And those are conflicts of goals. I don't think there's an easy answer to them. There's an advantage to studying in your native language. Naturally, you want to learn how to read. It's easier to learn in your native language than in a foreign language. On the other hand, there's a disadvantage to learning in your native language, namely you're going to be more remote from the centers of power. And you have to figure out how to evaluate that. And Black English is just a special case of it. And we call it Black English. It's just another language. Like where I grew up in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was like the first stop north on the south, you know, when former slaves came up from the south, they'd stop in Philadelphia. And I mean, like, you know, I'd ride in the streetcars, there'd be kids sitting behind me, I didn't understand a word they were saying. Literally not one word they were saying. They were just talking another language, you know. It's what we call Black English, you know. I was talking white English, a different language. But they're just two languages, you know. It's like French and German. There's no further question about them. If you have a French kid in a German school, should they be taught in French or in German? Well, you know, there are advantages both ways.
What you think about, for instance, some of the great leaders of change have been spiritual leaders, Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or Dalai Lama, and you don't seem to mention that when you speak. I mean, it seems like it's these co-ops or you know, corner grocery store or something like that, but looking at change they have brought on.
Well, let's take Martin Luther King. See, I think Martin Luther King was an important person, but I don't think he was a big agent of change. In fact, I think Martin Luther King was able to play a role in bringing about change because the real agents of change were doing the work. And the real agents of change were like SNCC workers. SNCC workers. I mean, you know, the real agents of change usually fall out of history. Okay, because we have a way of, you know, there's a way of it's necessary to distort history to make it look as if, you know, great men were doing things. That's what part of the way of teaching people you can't do anything, you're helpless. You got to wait for some great man to come around, he'll do it for you. That's part of the technique of disempowering people. But if you take a look at the civil rights movement, that's recent, we can look at it. It began with actually black students mostly. Actually, you know, take say Rosa Parks. The story about Rosa Parks is, you know, this courageous black woman suddenly decided, I had enough, I'm not going to sit in the back of the bus, which is sort of half true, but only half true. Rosa Parks came from a community, a well-organized community, which ultimately, in fact, has Communist Party roots, if you trace it back. It was a community of people who were working together and had, in fact, decided on a plan as to how to break through this system. And she was, in fact, part of the agent of that plan. Highlander School and so on and so forth. All of that's out of history, you know. What's in history is one person had courage to do something, which she did, you know, but not on her own. Nobody does anything on their own. I mean, she was coming out of an organized community of committed people who had been working together for a very long time. Martin Luther King was able to appear and give speeches because SNCC workers and freedom riders and so on had prepared the ground and taken a brutal beating for it. And these were incidentally pretty privileged kids, many of them. They chose it, you know, they didn't have to do it. And they're the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was important because he could stand up there and get cameras, you know. I think he probably saw it this way. At least I hope he did. He should have seen it this way. Gandhi is the same story, has a very mixed record. If you look at, you know, he was doing all sorts of things. But it was the people who were doing the work on the ground who prepared the basis for Gandhi to sort of articulate things. If you look at real movements, I think it's always like that.
Could you talk about a third party? Because you're always saying that Democrats and Republicans are so similar, and where the roots of that third party come from. And two, have you ever considered running for office, like to work things out on the inside?
Well, I think a third party, or fourth or fifth or whatever party, probably makes a lot of sense in the United States. I mean, it's really a second party. We only have one party as it now stands. We have a kind of a business party with several factions. And countries that have a kind of a labor-based party, you know, a popular party, there's things that can be done. It's not a huge change. I mean, almost every other country has this. But it does offer some options. So like take Canada right next door, a very similar country to ours, but different in some respects. One of the respects is the labor movement still exists. Another respect is it does have a popular-based party, the NDP, which is kind of mildly social democratic. Now, when the NDP gets into office, they do exactly the same thing as the other parties. I mean, they're indistinguishable. But they nevertheless are kind of like an umbrella party in which labor and women's groups and others can sort of get together and work together and so on. So they can, you know, they can press for particular issues that are of general interest. And you see the difference between Canada and the United States just for that reason. Like, take, say, health. In the United States, where there is no political party, just the business party, certain sectors of the population have been able to get health care for themselves, like the UAW. You know, some of the stronger unions were able to get pretty decent health care arrangements. The way it worked was that they were given those things instead of salary raises, you know. So, like my university, we got good health care. All right, it was sort of given instead of raising salaries one year. You know, that's the way it was done. So you can get if you're well enough organized and strong enough, you can get health care for yourself. But what happened in Canada is that those same groups, the labor movement, did not just get health care for themselves, they got it for the population. And they were able to do that because there was, in fact, a political structure through which they could work, which satisfied common interests, not just their local interests. Lacking that in the United States has never happened. Now, you know, a second party, that is a kind of a populist party, doesn't make a big change in the society. As I say, every other society that's like us has one. But it isn't a step forward. And in that sense, what's called a third party really should be called a second party, makes some sense. There was the second part, which oh, right.